the Lloyd Loar Gibson F-5, an instrument of near mythical status. Not only are these 100-year-old mandolins some of the most sought-after and valuable instruments in the world, but they're also still lauded as the pinnacle mandolin, being preferred and used by many of the best players out there today. This past year marks the centennial anniversary of the last batch of F-5s signed by legendary luthier Lloyd Loar, an occasion which elicits the question yet again: why are these mandolins still considered the gold standard by performers and luthiers alike? A question that has led me on quite the journey, from speaking to one of the leading experts on this topic, to finding myself in a room full of 5 of these mandolins being compared by some of my mandolin heroes, and even to getting to play one of these mandolins myself.
I'm not good enough for this, please take this away from me.
Yep. Sounds good when he plays it.
This is the amazing mandolinist Darren Nicholson, who I'm fortunate to call a friend. He recently came down to the studio with his June 13th, 1923 Loar, which is affectionately called Ferdinand after its original owner.
A Lloyd Loar mandolin, man. What is it like to own a piece of history like this?
I never dreamed I would have anything like this. I'd seen Lloyd Loar mandolins, been around them, but it was never even in my periphery that I would end up being an owner of one of these incredible instruments. And I go places all the time now, and people, the first thing they ask me, they don't ask me how my family's doing or how am I doing. They're like, how's Ferdinand? I'm like, oh yeah, the man. I have to, it takes me a second that they're so interested in this thing. So it does change your life.
Sitting beside Darren and getting to experience this thing in person, and even more so getting to play a few notes on it myself, I was kind of shaking a little bit. Not only because these instruments are incredibly valuable, but also they're so historically significant to the mandolin. And to truly understand the historical significance of these F-5 mandolins, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. And for me, that meant taking a road trip up to North Carolina to visit one of the leading experts on this topic, the incredible Tony Williamson.
The mandolin, of Italian origin, a descendant of the lute, an instrument known for its romantic serenades.
As Tony described it to me, the mandolin first came to America in this bowl-back shape and was happy to stay in that form until innovators like Orville Gibson reinvented the instrument in the early 20th century. In 1903, Gibson first advertised the round, symmetrical A model with the oval hole, much like you see here.
When innovators like Orville Gibson decided they didn't need the bowl anymore, and they created a back that was actually not completely flat, and the idea is to get a little more projection out of it.
That same year, Orville Gibson also advertised his new F-model mandolins, which still had oval holes but also had the more intricate scrolls and points that we know in F models today. They look similar to this mandola that Tony is playing here.
So Orville Gibson left the company in 1906, and they simplified some of his designs to create a mandolin much like this. But for 400 years, a mandolin had had an oval sound hole.
These new Gibson A and F model mandolins were a more robust and affordable alternative, and they quickly became the industry standard. They also ushered in what Walter Carter calls in this book the beginning of the golden age for the mandolin. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, mandolin orchestras were the rage, so were mandolin social clubs, and Gibson was really capitalizing on this new fad with these new mandolins. But in the events surrounding the First World War, with the rise of early jazz music and other louder styles, the mandolin couldn't really compete in terms of volume, and sadly, it was starting to decline in popularity. So around that time, the Gibson Company was looking for a new, innovative way to spark new interest in this 8-stringed instrument. And their answer came in the form of a young Lloyd Loar.
Now, in the 19th century, classical people began to look down on the lowly mandolin. Even though Mozart and Beethoven had both written for mandolin, they sort of disdained it as a folk instrument. So a man named Lloyd Loar, who was an inventor, a scientist, and a very good mandolin player, decided he wanted to make a mandolin that would be equivalent to the violin in expressiveness.
In 1920, Gibson hired Loar to come work in their factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan, as their new acoustic engineer. And there he worked with a team of very talented craftsmen to reinvent the mandolin yet again. And the result was this: Loar's brand new Gibson Master Mandolin Model F-5, as was first advertised for just $200 in 1922. This mandolin was meant to be a step above all of Gibson's other mandolins, with significant tonal and projection improvements due to the many innovations that Loar and his team came up with at the time.
See, that's a sound that could go all the way to the back of the concert hall.
These innovations are much too lengthy to go into detail here, but many of them include things that we know and love about the modern mandolin today. Things like the adjustable bridge, the adjustable truss rod, a longer neck with higher frets, which allowed for the bridge to be placed in the center of the top for better projection, parallel bracing under the top, and the top and back being tap-tuned in incredible detail by Loar and his team. But perhaps the most noticeable change here was the shift from the more classic oval sound hole to the F-shaped sound holes on either side of the bridge, more similar to that of a violin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the wood. They were using like the best wood at the time. They had great craftsmen. And there's also something like, you play like the old Gibson oval hole, and like there's kind of this vibe to the wood. You can kind of hear it. And these mandolins have that, but because it has the F holes, it just becomes like a totally new, like, I mean, it's an amazing feeling.
Now, did Lloyd Loar build mandolins? That's a question that we often get. And I think by now, most people realize that no, he did not build these instruments. He was an acoustic engineer that came into the Gibson Company and was able to take advantage of a tremendous group of craftsmen, many from old world guilds.
In a noisy room like this, you want this. It's mysterious. It's like trying to figure out what makes a wine taste good. There was clearly an aesthetic in that shop with all those builders, and they were tapping into something magical that all the great builders today are chasing. It's finish, it's wood selection, it's design. I mean, have you ever seen anything prettier in your whole life? So all that goes together to make something really special.
And perhaps one of the most talked about and scandalous innovations that Loar and his team came up with was the addition of this thing, the tone Verzi.
The Verzi.
The Verzi.
You have to go like that when you say it. Verzi. This is what it looks like.
Whoa, I've never seen one in person before. This
is an authentic Verzi tone producer. It fits inside the mandolin like that to the underside of the top, and the 2 feet come up right behind the bridge, and the other foot comes back here. Now you can see there's a little tack, a little tiny tack that holds them in place.
Wow.
And that's all that holds it there. The Verzi became, almost from the start, became controversial. What did it do? Does it really help? Bluegrass people took them out. A lot of people think it reduces volume. But the curious thing that I've found is that the Verzi projects away from the mandolin, and a non-Verzi F5 keeps the sound closer to the instrument.
I see, yeah.
So as it turns out, the non-Verzi actually works better with a microphone.
By the way, there is a fascinating recording over on the Mandolin Cafe from 1979 when Mike Marshall and Todd Phillips manually removed the tone Verzi from Mike's 1924 Lloyd Loar mandolin. All I'll say is there's a link down below. With all of these new innovations for the F5, the mandolin had finally been raised to a level of sophistication and design rivaling that of the violin. And yet, these F5s were a total flop, and Gibson really struggled to sell these mandolins despite increased promotional efforts. The mandolin could just not compete with this new loud music in a post-war era. So, sadly, Lloyd Loar signed his last F5 on December 1st of 1924 and left the Gibson Company for good, leaving his instruments to fade away into obscurity. That is, until the mid-1940s when a one William Smith Monroe happened upon a 1923 Gibson F-5 for sale for just $150 in the window of a Florida barbershop.
The F5, like you mentioned, was more intended for the concert hall, like when it was first engineered, but now it's so much associated with bluegrass music. And what do you think Bill's role was in popularizing the F5 and Lloyd Loar mandolins in general?
The presence of that man, from his point on stage in front of that microphone, he controlled the whole room. Everybody in the room. All his musicians, everybody's sitting there, riveted. His voice, his manner, his regal bearing, and more than anything, his mandolin. He would hold his mandolin up and go into one of those.
Largely because of Bill, the father of bluegrass music, this new mandolin-driven style was on the rise in the mid-century, with his July 9th, 1923 Lloyd Loar front and center. And sadly, the Gibson Company was not creating quality mandolins during this time like they were in the 1920s. So, for someone who was serious about learning this music, who wanted a quality mandolin, they had to look back.
There was only one reason, and one reason alone, that the 1923 F-5 began to be worth more than a brand new Gibson, and that was Bill Monroe. By the 60s and early 70s, a new Gibson F-5 just sounded awful. So you had to find an old mandolin. So we started looking and looking and looking. And when there's a limited quantity of something and a lot of people looking for it, then the price is going to go up.
A really interesting side note is that in 1985, Bill's Loar mandolin was infamously smashed to bits with a fire poker by some unknown burglar, only to have Gibson luthier Charlie Darrington painstakingly piece this mandolin together splinter by splinter over a 3-month period. And Bill went on to play that mandolin until he passed. And NPR reports that in Bill's estate sale, this same mandolin was sold for $1 million to the Country Music Hall of Fame, where it's on display today, making this mandolin, to my knowledge, the most expensive mandolin in the world. And while not all Lloyd Loar mandolins have quite a hefty price tag as Bill's, these mandolins today go for quite a bit more than the $200 they were initially advertised for in 1922. And part of that reason is that there's so few of these instruments out there today.
So Lloyd Loar only worked for the Gibson Company for a few years, and there's a limited number of these F5 mandolins out there. How many known signed Loars are in existence?
If memory serves, they have 270 signed Loar instruments identified.
Okay.
So now that's just what we know. How many did they actually make? There are no records.
So there could be a lot more out there, is that what you're saying?
Well, if you look at the blocks of numbers, there are some that are missing. How many, we don't know. And there's all kinds of stories. Who know if they're true? I heard that there was a man in Pennsylvania that had his Lloyd Loar buried with him, but I don't know. Who knows? Will they show up in a pawn shop? Will they show up in somebody's attic? Maybe. There have been those experiences in the last few years, but they're fewer and farther between.
And the market value for these 300-odd instruments that are out there has been one of the more intriguing aspects of these mandolins.
Why didn't I buy 2?
No, or 10. Is that what you paid?
65.
65, yeah.
You know?
I got mine 2 years later for 8.
Okay.
And it stayed there for a long time.
I finally got my first Loar in 1977 when I was with the Bluegrass Alliance. And at the time, it was a tremendous stretch to come up with the $6,500 that I paid for it then.
Wow.
And that was about the market value. I think it was 1980 that the first one sold for $10,000.
Wow.
But then it just started going way up. By 1990, I sold the first one for $20,000. By 1996, I hit $50,000. And 2000, $100,000.
What?
And in 2006, $250,000.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
that is
$250,000.
ridiculous.
And then 2007, 2008, there was recession and the mandolins just plummeted. A lot of people who had bought these instruments in the 60s and 70s wanted to sell them. And a lot of them had heard they were worth $200,000. And so all of a sudden the market was glutted. There were Loars everywhere for 200,000, and nobody's going to pony up that kind of money with the economy the way it was.
Oh, sure.
So that's kind of adjusted now. A good way to think about it is utility versus imagination. Okay, utility is how much the actual instrument is worth to you as a tool. I'm a musician.
Sure.
I record. I want the very best. It's worth a lot to me to have that. Imagination. I want to be like Bill Monroe. I want to play the mandolin he has. I want to have the prettiest one so I can show my friends. And I have a really good job and I make a lot of money. So what is a Lloyd Loar worth today? It's worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it and what someone is willing to sell it for.
It's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yep.
But the mystique of these mandolins goes well beyond their price tag or worth as a collector's item. There is something about the sound of these mandolins that captivates the attention of some of the best players out there today.
Well, for years, I thought maybe it was just a collector's item thing, until I got one and started playing it. And then I really got it. There's a lot of great builders out there, but there's nothing that can make up for 100 years of something being put together and the wood drying out and the aging, and there's just no way to replicate that. The way this thing is in the recording studio and on a microphone, there's just something different about it until you get it, and then all of a sudden your ear starts changing and you start listening for those things, the clarity and the mids and the highs and that bell-like sound, the way it cuts through a mix and the chop. Some of the mandolins I've had are just amazing mandolins when I'm sitting in a room playing by myself, but when you get in a band, it gets lost in the mix. But with these things, it's like, even if I don't hear it back here, I can put this thing on. I know they're getting it out there.
Yeah.
When you hear someone like John Reichman play his February 18th, 1924 Loar, you know this mandolin is more than a collector's item.
Why are these Loars so special?
The sound. Well, I mean, they're cool instruments. They've got this great history, but something about the sound. Maybe not while you're playing it, but I have this sense that it might not sound loud under your ear when you're playing it, but it's reaching out into the room.
And as I recently discovered in making this video, because Loar and his team were so meticulous in tap tuning the top and backs of these instruments, they actually resonate at all 12 partials in the overtones series, which is something that no mandolin before had done, and every luthier since has been trying to replicate in new mandolins.
What Lloyd Loar focused on was the creation of overtones, or what he called partials. So there's a G note, right? That note is comprised of quite a few partials. And you can hear 12 of them with the human ear. And you can hear 12 of them on a mandolin. They're almost 12, but for this purpose, I'm just going to use
Whoa, I've never seen that before.
yeah. The finger is too big to get your 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
That's
you have to
amazing.
get a little tiny, very slim ruler and put a little piece of felt on it to get the rest of them. So you can do all 12 on a Lloyd Loar. The key to an F5 is that it has the capacity, the design, the element of carving the woods to emphasize all these partials.
So what is the advantage of having all 12? Does it make it sound more full when you play?
To be able to have an instrument that can project all the partials is a powerful thing, because every note that you play has that complexity and nuance to it. That's what especially the 24 Loars are about, is complexity in its tone. And get this, every note has an equal distribution.
That's awesome.
You've got power on every note, and you don't have that on some of the earlier designs of mandolins. So that's the key to the F5 design. One of the many things that Lloyd Loar brought to Gibson.
That is amazing.
With that amount of detail going into the construction of a single mandolin, you can be certain that any one of the 300 or so lures that are out there are gonna sound amazing. So much so that many players choose to not do any modernization to their mandolins, much like Darren's all original lure here.
Everything's original on this. Absolutely everything. The fretboard, the keys, the tuners, tuning pegs. Only thing that's not original is the truss rod cover.
It just goes to show you don't really need to modernize anything about these mandolins. They've been taken good care of. They're good to go, man.
They were built right to begin with.
Yeah.
You know.
While others choose to make careful modifications to their lures to make them more suitable to their playing style, like Mike Marshall here.
See how I did mine? So I had a piece of shim put under this fingerboard because I wanted the bridge a little higher. I have the original bridge and tailpiece, and Monroe has all the shavings he took out of it in a jar on his desk.
How big of a jar is it? Like little jar, big jar?
It's a good. I think it's a bell jar. Like it's good size.
What kind of jar does
and the tone bars.
brand?
Yeah. And surprisingly, most of that wood came off the back.
And of course, all these mandolins sound fantastic, but one of the biggest discussion points surrounding these instruments are the tonal differences between the 1923 F5s that Loar signed and the ones from 1924. And I asked Tony if he could describe these nuances to a layman like myself.
There is a remarkable difference that I hope we'll be able to hear. The early F5s were designed for projection, for focus, to be able to do the thing in a concert hall that a really great classical violin would. So the idea is that it's got to be bright. All right, keep that in mind.
All right.
And then we're going to move to a 1924. The first thing you'll notice is that a much darker color.
It's so much darker. I've never seen them side by side like that.
Yep.
That's amazing.
The much darker color, and a much darker sound.
It's like night and day. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so the idea is that by 24, it was more about the nuance, the warmth of the bottom end.
I don't know. I don't claim to be any kind of mandolin expert, and it's been my experience that there can be 10 mandolins in the same batch and they all sound different. Mm-hmm. Bill Monroe's mandolin and all the mandolins in the July 9 batch, like, they all sound different. Mm-hmm. You know, I do like this one because, you know, there's some of the lures like Bill's mandolin that almost sounded angry, like it was just loud and just punching through all the time, the tone. And I love that this mandolin can get angry, but there's also some really sweet tones in there too.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, there is so much variance from batch to batch, but as a rule of thumb, it goes to explain why most traditional bluegrass mandolin players tend to prefer the 1923 lures like Bill had, whereas more progressive modern players like John Reichman, Mike Marshall, Chris Thiele, they tend to prefer the darker 24 lures. And Thiele reportedly has 2 from this year, and all I'll say is if he ever wants to part with one, I'd be happy to take it off his hands. Which brings me to that faded room that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, where I got to hear 5 lures being compared by some of my mandolin heroes. While teaching at the Swannanoa Gathering this summer, between instructors, students, and friends nearby, we were able to wrangle all of these instruments together in the same place, and the result was nothing less than magical.
I like this part on this one right here. And this here, that's a pretty side by.
Actually, this, where's the one? You want a well-wore in.
Oh, I like them when they've been whooped up on.
3 February 18th.
Yeah.
Oh, is it real?
Yeah.
February 18th.
Wow.
February 18th, February 18th.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What's your serial number again?
75327.
Oh, it's very early. It's that early band.
Yeah.
690-327-729. Shall we flip them?
Yes, please.
This is good. I'm feeling to see who practiced the most. Check this out. Rub right there. The dark binding is further out than the light.
Mine had all the finish on it.
Wow, yeah. That's you. All of it.
You can feel it.
It wears
the ripples.
more, the light wears more than the dark.
Oh yeah, look.
I've been seeing a lot of people post videos.
Wow, gotta get playing.
I know.
Yeah, you got to get practicing, man. You
feel it on that?
come on now.
There's a little bit coming off right here.
Just being a fly on the wall while all of this was happening, while these amazing mandolin players were comparing notes on setup and technical details about their lures, and just having a shared reverence and respect for these mandolins, it's hard to explain in words how it felt, but it was so palpable about how these mandolins are something special.
What would you say makes these mandolins so special?
I'm not sure what makes them so special, but man, it's so cool to see them, huh?
So the top on this one is not book matched.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's the secret to the sound.
They say that's something.
It's either two different trees or I don't know what, but it's wider on the base than. Yeah.
You think it was intentional?
I don't know. I wonder about it. Like,
Do some
somebody's
builders
like
think about that?
tighter for the treble and bigger for the bass. Yeah, you know, when I got this mandolin, not long after, it dipped in right there.
Oh.
And our friend Todd Phillips said maybe if we put a full contact bridge, it'll disperse the pressure. And
Sam Bush swears
he
by
put
it.
ebony in there, and then it addressed the problem. It came flattened out. Yeah.
So how are we in terms of width? Like I know mine's a little bit narrower than, I think July 9th would be wider. These look pretty similar.
This one's kind of narrower.
Have you heard that speculation that they're retrofitted with Verzies?
Yeah.
And that's why
That they sawed the backs off.
on the back stuff, and that's why they're a little
Thinner?
Yeah. I don't know. That's
That makes sense, though.
yeah.
Yeah, it's about half the width of a binding, right? Something like that. A little bit like sitting in front of a pile of cream puffs and not eating them, man. Let's play these.
And then it was kind of like kids in a candy shop. One by one, these amazing players took turns playing all 5 lures back to back to back.
You know, you got to know how to play each mandolin. That's the unfair part of this.
Speed dating.
Is that exactly. I'll just go through them all like that. Each of us should do the same, right? Zoom. One of each, please. Yours, Sean. It plays itself.
Makes its own gravy.
Right. Okay, Johnny, you next.
I was struck by 2 things. One, all of these mandolins sounded amazing, but they all sounded different too. Those tonal qualities aren't just a placebo or something people talk about, they're real. But also I was struck by how every mandolin sounded different in every player's hand.
You learn what it wants. Who's that?
This is Alan's here.
I hope you guys remember.
It's so true. I think the tone and the talent that a player gets is so much from this and not as much from this, even though this is important.
What would you say, Casey, that makes these Lloyd Loars so special?
You think the back came off of that?
The folks who play them are all really good players. The mandolins are great too, but you know, Mike Marshall can make a piece of wood sound good.
And I think Casey really hit the nail on the head here. These mandolins are not only legendary because they're unparalleled in craftsmanship and tone, but also because some of the best mandolin players ever have chosen to use them. And the whole musical landscape for this instrument has been shaped by those players. And the cool thing is that even though these mandolins are 100 years old now, is that they're still out there being played. They're not just museum pieces. They're still having an impact on what the future of this instrument is. And it is amazing to witness this now.
It's the fact that Bill Monroe, Bobby Osborne, all the way up to Mike Marshall, John Reichman, Chris Thiele, Andrew Marlin. I mean, a good player who wants the best sound is going to wind up with one of these. I've had people argue, I've played a Loar and it doesn't sound as good as my so-and-so. That's because you're trying to make the mandolin do what you do rather than let the mandolin teach you to do what it wants to do.
If you'd like to learn even more about this fascinating topic, there are 2 books that have been incredibly helpful in making this video. One, The Mandolin in America by Walter Carter, and The Life and Work of Lloyd Loar by Roger H. Siminoff. You should check out Tony Williamson's blog about this topic too. There's a link down below. He goes into incredible detail about all this stuff. Just a huge thanks for him sharing his knowledge for this project. And of course, as you can imagine, producing videos like this takes an awful lot of time. And if you'd like to support the channel to see more content like this, please consider subscribing down below or joining over on Patreon at the link down there as well. And if you'd like to hear more of my amazing interview with Darren Nicholson, then I'd recommend checking out this video right here. And hopefully I'll see you over there real soon.